When you spawn into Blood of the Dead, right away you see Richtofen's lab under Alcatraz, and alongside that, the cryo chambers that hold none other than our Victis characters, and this seems to make perfect sense with the storyline that we've been told thus far, and that's because, as we know from the timeline, Richtofen had the Victis crew go on a mission to do a couple different things, but most of them don't matter, but the main one that actually matters is that he had them go get the chronorium, and when he had them get the chronorium for him, they of course had to bring it to him, and when they did so, they met up in this lab under Alcatraz, and after reading it, Richtofen gave the Victis crew two different options, and one of them was for him to teleport them to wherever they wanted, and the other one was to just put them in cryostasis until the final world arrives, and as we all know, they chose to go in cryostasis, and this seems to be right where we were inside the Blood of the Dead intro, and really the word Blood of the Dead even takes place, and this would kind of make sense why we see the cryo chambers inside Blood of the Dead. Except the problem is that it just kinda doesn't make too much sense with the timeline that we were given back in Zombies Chronicles, and I want to explain why that is the case. But before we can get into any of that, I first need to do a quick explanation on how the Alcatraz pocket dimension works, or how it exists in the first place, and you'll understand why I need to explain this in just a little bit, but first let me just do a quick summary. So we actually learned how this pocket dimension was created and what's purpose in the first place from the radios inside Blood of the Dead with the Warden talking to the Shadow Man. And of course, in those radios, it is explained to us that the Shadow Man had the Warden create this pocket universe using the Mob of the Dead characters somehow, not exactly sure how that works till this day, but he used them to make the Alcatraz pocket dimension for the sole purpose of capturing Dr. Edward Richtofen, for they could capture him and use his blood to free the Apothecans from wherever they were trapped. Presumably, it would be under All Creation or the Dark Ether. And that is pretty much how that's explained. Now, there's more to get into with that own. I mean, I've already made videos talking about that part of it, but really all you need to understand is what this pocket dimension really is. It's just a pocket dimension created by the souls or something like that of the mobsters to create this pocket dimension to capture Richtofen. That's pretty much the gist of it that you have to understand. Now, the reason why I explained the pocket dimension is something we'll come back to in a little bit, but for now, I want to point out something that seems like it should have been pointed out all the way back in May when we first saw the intro to Blood of the Dead. But of course, it's that, yes, Blood of the Dead takes place inside the Alcatraz pocket dimension. We know this because during the Easter egg, we see the mobster characters in there, so we obviously know this pocket dimension for a bunch of different reasons, to be completely honest. I mean, the Warden being there and zombies being there is probably the most obvious. And the reason this is a huge problem is because Richtofen did not build his lab inside the pocket dimension, and this is what I find quite weird, because Richtofen in-game in Blood of the Dead would have you believe otherwise, and in fact, he has a quote saying it was a dumb idea to build his lab inside a twisted little pocket dimension, which makes no sense because he just didn't do that. Because if we look at the timeline, we can actually see in Dimension 63 on April 16th, 1940, Richtofen arrives in Dimension 63, not in the Alcatraz pocket dimension, but in Dimension 63, where he contacts members of the Illuminati and enlists their help to build a laboratory facility beneath Alcatraz. So that's kind of a big problem for this idea of Richtofen building his lab inside the pocket dimension when he just didn't do that. It just never happened, and that's a really, really big problem. But then you could go back to the whole idea that, oh yeah, but the pocket dimension is a complete replica of what existed inside Dimension 63, and that should relieve you of this problem, correct? not exactly, because there's another problem with all of this, because even if this pocket dimension is a complete replica, which I do not doubt, of what was going on inside Dimension 63, the problem is that Richtofen's lab, which of course without Richtofen's lab existing in the first place, Victus couldn't even be involved to begin with, especially be frozen. But the main problem is that the lab wasn't built for 6 years after the pocket dimension, the Alcatraz pocket dimension, was created. Because remember what I said and how I said the pocket dimension was created. It was created using the mobsters, and when they died, the pocket dimension was created, and this lines up with the timeline, because on the timeline we see January 19th, 1943. Found guilty of Al's murder, Sel, Finn, and Billy are executed by electric chair. And then right after that, Mob of the Dead pops up. And of course, Mob of the Dead's Sel, Finn, Bell, and Al will fight waves. Yeah, but it doesn't really matter. But regardless, that's when it pops up, because that's how the pocket dimension was created, by their souls or whatever it may be. But remember the date, that was 1943. And what did I say about in the timeline when Richtofen first even tried to build the lab under Alcatraz? It was April 14th, 1940. That is actually 6 years later. 6 years later, and the pocket dimension was already created. So unless this pocket dimension constantly copies what's going on inside Dimension 63, it honestly doesn't make too much sense, and that would be a big problem. Probably that's not true. I mean, there's so many different problems. That means we would have so many different copies of Richtofen premise and stuff like that. I mean, it'd be a little bit ridiculous. So we just know that it's not constantly copying what's going on inside the original Dimension 63 compared to its own pocket dimension. And what makes it even better is that the Victus crews weren't even put on ice. Victus was not put in cryostasis until July 4th, 1941. That's 7 years after the Alcatraz pocket dimension even appeared in the first place. And it just doesn't make sense how they would somehow end up in the pocket dimension, because we have no evidence for why anything would just for some reason move to the pocket dimension, especially Victus though. That one makes no sense, because at least for premise you could say, well, they were teleported to the wrong place instead of being teleported to the original Dimension 63. Instead, they were teleported to this pocket dimension, which would be fine, because that's something I could easily overlook. It's a nice answer for it. But the problem is that Victus were most definitely put under ice or put in cryostasis inside Dimension 63 and not this Alcatraz pocket dimension. So that brings us to the problem. Why do we see both Richtofen's lab and Victus inside the Alcatraz pocket dimension? It actually doesn't make any sense with the Zombies Chronicles timeline, and that's what just leaves me kind of stumped why we see either of these things existing inside this pocket dimension. And of course, there's a lot of ways they can explain this away. They could explain that it just for some reason teleported Victus over here. Maybe Richtofen decided in this weird timeline, and I want to get into this. They could also say that this is an entirely different timeline. So in this timeline, Richtofen did build his lab under Alcatraz inside the pocket dimension and not in Dimension 63. And that is just a little bit frustrating for me, and I imagine a lot of people who are interested in the storyline, because no matter the explanation they give, it's really just going to annoy me, because the main one with the whole new storyline or timeline, which is the one we expect more than any other one, is that what was the use of giving us that old timeline if it's no use anymore? Like, actually, so what am I supposed to do with this old timeline that's supposed to tell me that Mob of the Dead, or the Blood of the, the Alcatraz pocket dimension popped up back in 1934, and of course this would make it for it's impossible for Victus to be frozen under the lab, or I guess just frozen inside the Alcatraz pocket dimension instead of Dimension 63. It should make it impossible according to the timeline timeline. But if we're dealing with a new timeline, that would make sense, but why give us the original timeline? It just doesn't make any sense. And I think that's what they're doing here, that this old timeline we had is just not really that reliable to relate to our current timeline that we're dealing with. And that's just really frustrating for me, because it just leaves me wondering, well, what old information that you've given us can actually be reliable now? If the timeline itself that was released not even 3 years ago, like 1.5, maybe 2 years ago, is no longer reliable, what older information do we have that we can rely on to relate to the storyline? And this is a problem I've been seeing with this storyline for a while now. Ever since Black Ops 4 launched, I've been noticing a lot of different things. Like, I try to relate it to older information and I just can't, because it's just something that they're not doing anymore because they started a new timeline. And I just don't really like it all that much, because the main reason I've loved Treyarch Zombies storytelling for so long is that the community could kind of figure, or at least trying to understand what's going on by looking at older information and connecting the dots. But if our old information is no longer reliable, then what are we going to do anymore? Are we just now going to have to treat this like every other story ever, that we just go through it and just have to enjoy just by watching it, which isn't a problem, because most stories are told that way, but that's not how we've enjoyed Treyarch Zombies storyline. It just makes me really frustrated with what they're doing with the storyline. And of course, I could be mistaken here, and they could have an explanation that I'm just not aware of, but I'm putting my money on that we're just dealing with a new timeline, and that's just like an entirely new one. In the past, because I'm fine that the timeline would change past Zetsubonoshima, but the thing is that anything before that should stay the same with the old timeline. That's at least how I thought it would be. But it looks like that's just not the case. And it looks like they're probably going to have an entirely new timeline from the start to finish. And I just don't like that. But anyways, I know I disguised this video as Victus shouldn't be in Blood of the Dead and that sort of thing, and instead just directed it towards a little rant here at the end. But it's just something I see as a little frustrating. And I don't know why, but well, actually I do know why, but the thing is with Black Ops 4 Zombies story so far, it's more of that doesn't make sense with what we have, instead of just saying, oh wait, why does that work? And we just don't have the answers yet. It's just something that's kind of frustrating for me, and I really don't like how they're telling the story. But anyways, I'm going to be quiet here right now, and I just would love to hear what you guys are thinking about this. Are you guys liking what they're doing with the storyline now? You not liking it? Am I overreacting to this, and they're just going to go fix everything within the next few months or so? I just love to hear what you guys are thinking about this. But if you guys did enjoy the video, go ahead, do all the normal YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, bell, share, and especially bell. But I'm going to go, and I'll catch you guys in the next stream or video.